Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Lupina lecture for November. Tonight we are very pleased and honored to have with us Professor Jean Bethke Elshtain, who is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. Professor Elshtain grew up in northern Colorado, and she eventually migrated east to do her graduate studies in Massachusetts at Brandeis University. Since that time, she first taught at the University of Massachusetts, then went on to teach at Vanderbilt University, and since 1995 has been teaching at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. There she's also cross-appointed to the Committee of Social Thought and also to the Political Science Department. Professor Elshtain has had numerous appointments. Has been both Professor of Philosophy, of Divinity, and Political Science in her many appointments. And in her publications, Professor Elshtain also shows that great versatility and cross-disciplinary talents. Her books over the years have included her first book, Public Man, Private Woman, on women in social and political thought, another book, Women in War, and question of war has been an abiding interest of Professor Elshtain's over the years, and has written not only books, but numerous articles on various questions related to war. Her most recent book, and also her Gifford Lectures, is Sovereignty, God, State, and Self, which was published in 2008. Professor Elshtain, as well as authoring over 20 books, has authored somewhere in the realm of 400 to 500 articles, and also many pieces of public opinion in various popular as well as scholarly journals. She's held numerous chairs, and among our interests of tonight, she's also been member of the President's Council of Bioethics in the United States, and she's also a member of the Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are extremely honored to have Professor Elshtain, and tonight she will speak on the topic to heal or to cure. Welcome, Professor Elshtain.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks. I'm all set. Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out on this chilly evening. I said to some of you earlier that if I were sitting in my nice toasty home, I wouldn't come out to see me. So I'm very happy that you in fact have done that. With that, I think I'll simply begin, because you're probably wondering exactly what I'm talking about or what this title means, the distinction between curing and healing. So with that, let me begin. As you know, we all want good health. It is one of life's great blessings. We all fear disease, especially certain diseases. We can think of the dreaded word cancer, for example. When I was a child, one of those dreaded words was polio, or infantile paralysis. And that word became a reality for my family and me. And the reality was every bit as dreadful as the word. Unsurprisingly, we rejoiced when the polio vaccine came into use, although it was too late to be of any direct benefit to me. Children would now be spared. Health would triumph over disease. Now, throughout my lifetime, the bar has been raised higher and higher and higher yet on what counts as health and what counts as illness or disease. We have come so far, and we've done so much. How many times do we hear sort of martial metaphors when we think of disease? We will conquer this disease. We have a war on cancer. We will defeat the germs and so forth. We will triumph over this or that. Certainly once we conquered polio, we moved on to conquer something else. And we're distressed if the war seems to go on against a disease like cancer. We issue reports from the battlefront on a regular basis about just how near we are to the final victory, which has thus far eluded us. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong as I go on to offer what I have to say tonight. It's terribly important to make scientific headway against illnesses that led to human suffering. That's a great achievement. And certainly God gave us minds to use, gifted us with free will. But there's always the serpent in the garden, isn't there? That our wills, we are told in Scripture, turned against God in that fateful moment in the garden, and we fell, and forever after our wills were flawed, and our minds can never aspire to moral perfection, nor can we achieve perfection in our human projects. Now, why bother to mention the fall in the same breath as I talk about the greatness and inescapability of medical and scientific advance? I do so because we forget on a daily basis that we are, in fact, limited creatures. Indeed, many are now determined, in the transhumanist movement, for example, to conquer finitude itself. And mortality is construed as a kind of illness that we can figure out how to cure. There is even talk in some circles of immortalization, of creating a world in which my DNA somehow goes on forever, as if that means that I do, and death has really been banished. Now, when I suggested to one enthusiast who was preaching immortalization, and who said as well that he was a Christian believer, when I suggested that the quest for immortalization in the name of health and wellness did in fact not comport with Christian belief, he seemed genuinely puzzled. He believed that when the Lord told us that he came that we might have life and might have it more abundantly, that meant we were sort of unleashed in order to devise a way to live forever, if we could find one such, and in perfect health, too. At a wellness clinic that I attended, one speaker lectured us about the new ideal of human life that pertains in the wellness movement. And as he presented it, it held that rather than, at some ideal future moment, rather than experiencing any sense of the decline of our powers, we could at some point aspire to stay completely hale and hearty, completely fit, and then one day we would just sort of up and die. But in the meantime, we would not have been a burden to ourselves or to others. We wouldn't have lingered on in some unseemly fashion. We wouldn't have been caught up in illness and dependency. So weakness is a horror in these scenarios. Helplessness is something akin to an affront. Now, the new concepts of health assume that we cannot have enough, that we can always grow fitter, and we should, and only moral slackers devote themselves to other things when, with their spare time, they could be lifting weights or doing aerobic dance. So a form of moral censure sometimes descends on those who are unfit and unwell. There's a sort of subtle and sometimes not so subtle suggestion that they brought it on themselves. Now again, I don't want you to get me wrong. We are obliged to respect our bodies. We are obliged to care for our bodies. We should not harm our bodies heedlessly. But I don't think that's what is at stake here. What is at stake, it seems to me, is a quest for perfect control. And the assumption, again, is that nature, the creator, set things up rather badly. This is the underlying assumption, that we're trapped in this limited body, we're trapped in finitude, and we need to do something about that. Now, I've written and spoken previously about the quest for control and the way in which we are starting to sort people out by genetic criteria. In our demand for bodily perfection, for a standard of health that weeds out the unfit, it strikes me we are moving back into the realm of eugenics, despite the lessons of history about all of this. The assumption, again, is the body we inhabit is imperfect, is unhealthy in some fundamental sense. It's subject to the vagaries of illness and aging, and the future body will somehow be our own gleaming fabrication. And we measure this body against a standard of health and perfection that promises an endless supply of new body parts via stem cell research, again, at some perfect future point. And some have even suggested that clonees, not being fully human, might be kept alive in order that their organs could be harvested to replace the worn-out organs of non-clonees. And there, in fact, has been a rather brilliant novel about this. Why am I forgetting the title? But at any rate, a rather brilliant novel. And we will look up the title for you. And it made it into a not too great film. Now, there's a terrible irony in all this. Even as we as a culture are enjoined to become fully in control of our bodies at every moment, we also, and to be healthy at every moment, we also pride ourselves on our enlightened attitude toward persons with disabilities, those who are not fit in the way that we are enjoined to be, those who can't belong within our standard of fitness. We don't want to deny anybody his or her rights or access to what everybody else has. So even as we zoom along in our quest for perfect health, we make provision for those who by definition can never attain such a standard. Well, we need to ask just how secure is this concern? How sturdy are these provisions for the unfit? So I'd ask you to consider the following, and I'm going to put it in the form of a strong thesis, namely that liberal society, our own, cannot sustain equal regard for persons with disabilities over the long run, especially so if these disabilities are mental. And it cannot do this because our governing assumptions push so strongly in the direction of privileging choice and autonomy as primary goods in human life. Now, celebrating choice as the apogee of human aspiration, we now combine choice with modern technologies of reproductive and genetic engineering. And these technologies and our dominant philosophy dictate that it would be far better if persons who are incapable of choosing on this model of what the ideal human being is, if such people were no longer to appear among us. And our standard of health suggests as much. So we strive through clumsy methods like abortion at present, through genetic engineering that will become ever more sophisticated, to ensure that such persons are not born. The assumption is that the question is sort of, who would want to be born unfit anyway, is what we say in effect. And so strong is the prejudice that pushes in this direction that we assume that hypothetical unborn children with disabilities would, if they could, choose not to be born. For those who would choose to be born with a limitation. Now, within our dominant framework, people with handicaps who are among us should be given access. They should not be discriminated against unjustly. We've moved beyond the years of hiding such people away. But the fact that such human beings have rights if they live in our midst does nothing to mitigate the urgent cultural norms that measure progress by how successful we have been at lowering the incidence of births of persons with disabilities. For example, in the United States, at least, over 80% of pregnancies with babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted, are ended. Despite all our hoopla about difference then, if the different stand before us in broken bodies and with broken minds, that is a difference that our standard of wellness tells us we should do something to eliminate. The medical profession and the wider culture certainly urge us in the direction of aborting such human beings. There's a general assumption that if a pregnancy is diagnosed as a Down syndrome pregnancy, that the next thing you do is make an appointment for an abortion. I don't know if that's true in Canada. It's certainly true in the United States. In our brave new world in which we will all be born well and only grow weller, if I may coin a neologism here, this admittedly clumsy method of the present moment can be replaced by a system of positive eugenics at some point in the future. Now, one leading bioethicist, not a marginal figure at all, describes the profoundly retarded as, quote, human non-persons, human non-persons. These are beings with membership in the human species, but they have no standing in, quote, the secular moral community. Right? This is a bioethicist named Tristan Engelhardt. So our standard of health precludes this full standing, human non-persons. Now, if this attitude comes to prevail on a general scale, the barriers to the elimination of such persons will, I'm convinced of this, inexorably wither away. And if we go the direction of the Netherlands and approve physician-assisted or medicalized euthanasia, such human non-persons could be removed from among us after birth, as they are now eliminated before birth via selective abortion. And in fact, we have the implementation in the Netherlands of protocols for the euthanizing of newborns with disabilities, written by Dr. Verhagen and brought into being something like 6 years ago. Now, to be sure, many of those who say that the radically unwell lack full moral standing do not necessarily think it is a good idea to deprive them of life. Given our religious traditions, public barriers to the killing of persons with severe disabilities remain, but such barriers are under continuous pressure to succumb to the demands of secular morality, with its rising standard of what counts as health, hence what counts as a normative ideal of what it means to be a person. So standards of health and illness are not just neutral diagnoses of conditions along objective medical criteria. Such standards take on a potent normative dimension and shape, often subtly, the contours of our assessment of what is a good life, what is a healthy life, what is a life worth living. And if I am correct in this, and if we keep moving in this general cultural direction, it seems likely that over time, the remaining inhibitions and prohibitions embedded deeply in our moral intuitions, as these have been shaped by Judaism and Christianity, will slowly but surely give way. There's an ethicist named Hans Reinders, among others, and he has shown that, in his words, people with mental disability and their families have reasons to be worried about their future in liberal society. The rapid proliferation of genetic testing will have discriminatory effects because it brings the birth of disabled children within the focus of reproductive choice, which makes their parents answerable to the charge of irresponsible behavior. End of quote. You see where he's going there. If you know that a baby is going to be born with disabilities, you are irresponsible if you persist in carrying that pregnancy to term. Now, responding to a column I had written on the theme of cloning and genetic manipulation, the mother of a Down syndrome child wrote to me, expressing her deep foreboding on this very theme. She indicated that she worried about societal provision and assistance for persons with disabilities and their families should the time come, and it was approaching rapidly, when parents who chose to bring an unwell child into the world, for mental disability is by definition a sign of unwellness, when they could have aborted and spared themselves, society, and the child himself or herself, they would be labeled irresponsible and therefore wholly culpable. Why should we, the healthy, support those who have chosen irresponsibly in favor of a disease or a condition that we regard as unhealthy in the deepest, and one might even say, ontological sense? And it was very interesting, just as an aside, during the last presidential election in the United States, that the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, I'm sure you've heard of her, Sarah Palin, and I'm not going to discuss her politics, but what was fascinating is that she is the mother of a Down syndrome baby, and there were extraordinary attacks on she and her husband for choosing to bring a Down syndrome baby into the world. That this set a very bad example for the rest of the population. I collected a lot of the attacks that were being published in journals and online journals and so forth. Some of them were really quite extraordinary, and really brought to mind some of the arguments for genocide during the National Socialist era, on cost-benefit criteria, which is one of the arguments that was made in Germany at the time, that well people, healthy people, should not be dragged down by having to provide support for the unwell, for those who were genetically inferior. And you probably know that the first killing programs in National Socialist Germany aimed at the destruction of people with disabilities. Those were the first victims, people with mental and physical disabilities. Now, I'm not suggesting that's where we are, but just that there's a sort of really creepy, familiarity with some of the arguments that one reads from time to time about why such people need to be eliminated or should not be born. So none of what I have been saying is the stuff of science fiction. It's really the texture of our ethical lives at this moment. And the urgency to eliminate flaws is palpable. Our understanding of humanity narrows as our normative ideal of what counts as a healthy person expands. Accepting the unwell and those with disabilities becomes an ever more arduous task. And this leads me to the unhappy conclusion that modern liberal culture, a good and brilliant culture in so many ways, is not in a strong position to sustain support for the unwell, particularly if that takes the form of prolonged illness or disability. That our quest for control and prevention pushes us toward the elimination of certain conditions, and that in turn may even invite, at some terrible future moment, elimination of persons on the grounds that, although they may belong to the human species, they are not full-fledged members of the secular moral community, as we've already been told in the essay that I quoted from. Now, some of you may be wondering what all this has to do with healing. And to discuss this, I want to turn to Jesus' healing mission in Scripture, and to see if we can offer up a contrast to some of our contemporary notions of health and what that involves and what it means, and of disease, when even conditions like being born as a Down syndrome child are considered some kind of unacceptable disease that we should find ways to eliminate. What is health? What is health? What is disease? What is healing? What is curing? Now, some would ask, how does our quest to cure, change, control differ from what Jesus himself did? Didn't he eliminate certain conditions? Didn't he make the lame to walk and the blind to see? Was he not working to eliminate imperfections himself? Now, I hasten to add that I'm not a biblical exegete, but putting the questions this way seems to me inadequate, and I think it misses something basic. For Jesus helps us to think about another critical distinction that we systematically eliminate or elide altogether, and that's the distinction between what it means to cure and what it means to heal. Now, I want to remind us of a few of those scriptural moments. I draw all of these from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 8, 5-17 recounts the story of Jesus healing a paralyzed servant who's in terrible distress. And when the centurion in Capernaum tells the Lord of his servant in distress, Jesus says, "I will come and heal him." The centurion tells Jesus he's unworthy for the Lord to enter under his roof. "Only say the word and my servant will be healed." When Jesus hears the centurion's tale of his worldly power, "I am a man of authority with soldiers under me," but his weakness, confronted with the paralysis of his servant, leading the centurion to a conviction of his own unworthiness, Jesus says to him that he has not, even in Israel, found such faith. And he then sends the man forth with these words, "Be it done for you as you have believed." And we are told that the servant was healed at that very moment. Now, hard upon this story comes one about Peter's mother-in-law lying sick with fever. Jesus touches her and she is healed. Then, the same evening, many who were possessed with demons are brought to him. Matthew tells us he cast out the evil spirits with a word and healed those who were sick. It doesn't speak of cure, but healing. And this healing mission continues with a famous story in Matthew 9 of the ruler who comes to Jesus, telling him his daughter has died. He pleads with Jesus to come with him and to lay his hand on her, for then she will live. Now, following the ruler, Jesus is in turn followed by a woman who has suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. And she touches the fringe of Jesus' garment, believing if she can but touch the garment, she will be made well. And Jesus turns and sees her, you will recall, and tells her, "Take heart, for your faith has made you well." And upon arriving at the ruler's house, Jesus tells the grieving to depart, for the girl is only sleeping. The crowd laughs, but the girl rises when Jesus takes her by the hand. Now, throughout the district, word spreads. Blind men follow him. It's their expression of belief prior to the Lord's touch that is essential to their healing. Matthew 15 tells another story of demonic possession. We learn of the plea of a Canaanite woman who begs Jesus to have mercy on her, for my daughter is severely possessed by a demon. The disciples want to send her away, and we get the impression that her pleading has made her a nuisance. They want her just out of sight. And Jesus initially says he has been sent but to the lost sheep of Israel, but the woman's faith touches him. Great is your faith, he proclaims, and the daughter is healed. Now, what are we to make of all this? Should contemporary Christians be a bit embarrassed because the healing miracles seem rather fantastic? And some even find the healing miracles problematic because they say the story suggests that there is in fact something wrong with being with lameness or blindness or profuse bleeding or demon possession. There are some in the handicap rights movement who've made these kinds of arguments. And further, the argument is it's certainly unacceptable to depict mental illness, for that's what we would call it now, as demonic possession in the manner that Scripture does. Now, I would submit that this argument really stands in the way of a deeper understanding of what is going on here. And derangement to healing. Your faith has made you well, has made you whole. There's a quest for a kind of wholeness that goes beyond the sort of physical cure. Remember that Jesus elsewhere chides those of little faith who demand external signs for everything, those who demand evidence, and all of us at one time or the other are such persons. The key to authentic healing, the stories tell us, is faith, that healing can occur in the absence of a cure. And that is precisely the distinction that elides us or stuns us so much that we don't know what to make of it. So we find that in the biblical narratives, people are both healed and cured. After all, Jesus, as the Son of God, is enacting an ethic of the end time that is not available to ordinary human beings on this earth. But what we learn from these stories is that human beings can, in fact, be healed even though they are not cured. You can be made whole. Something I observed many years ago when I spent 5 months in the Children's Hospital in Denver, Colorado, in a ward crammed with polio kids, of whom I was one, was that some children were certainly healed without being cured. You couldn't be cured of polio. You got better or you didn't. And even though you got better, it turns out many years later you get worse again because of the post-polio syndrome you've maybe heard about. Others, at times, those who were not as severely stricken as many of the rest of us, were neither healed nor cured. These children grew silent, depressed, angry. They retreated into babyhood, if you will. They were overwhelmed with anxiety. Yet others approached their illness with sadness. Of course, what child could not be sad at the loss of childhood, really, but also with a kind of calmness and determination. What made the difference here? Well, I can't explore this matter as an empirical one, Why did this child retreat into emotional isolation, or that child retain his or her ability to reach out to others and to participate in fellowship? I don't have the answer to all of that. But I can affirm that in the absence of a cure, there can be healing. I certainly saw this with the life and death of my own Aunt Martha, who died in April, who had been ill off and on with cancer for over 16 years. And what was remarkable, my final visit with her, and this was the experience everyone had, was how she was profoundly healed, even though death was imminent. And that what she imparted to others in our final visits with her was a sense of this deep wholeness and serenity in her faith, in her good humor, her love of life, her joy at what life had meant, and her confidence in her departing, that she would in fact greet her loved ones who had departed before her and would see others at some point in heaven. Now, we act, I think the recognition that there can be healing without a cure is one that we're in danger of losing. We act as if the absence of a cure is an unnecessary irritation in minor cases or a violent affront in other cases. Let me just very briefly, as another aside, tell you that when I was patient advocate for a colleague when I was at Vanderbilt University who was dying of a very pernicious leukemia, one of the things I learned at the time that I spent in the cancer ward was how many parents, absolutely desperate that their child be cured, put the child through one horrific protocol after another when the chances of success were about 3%. Even though the children themselves begged for this to stop. The children were far more prepared to accept death than their families were. There has to be a cure. And the pressures that doctors are under is often sometimes extreme. We tend to think that the pressure comes from doctors because they want to cure everybody. It sometimes comes from families as well. We expect modern medicine to cure everybody. Now, studies of the worlds of dying children suggest that the children who were healed before dying of their illnesses were those whose families were honest with them, who loved them, who let go of their anger, who kept the family circle alive until it was cruelly broken by death. The children who were neither cured nor healed were being protected by frightened parents who, because they were so fearful and anxious, removed themselves emotionally from their own children. Doctors were frustrated in this situation. They believed that the children shouldn't be told what was going on, but the children knew what was happening, and the adults around them were not being honest with them. The adults were thinking primarily about themselves and not about the child. So they eclipsed the space within which a kind of healing might have taken place before the child died. When we are consumed by our own emotions, we cannot faithfully tend to nor offer ourselves to others. So there's a powerful need of healing, and because we seek exclusively a cure, healing may elude us. Now, in 1944, C.S. Lewis published a very prescient book called The Abolition of Man. And Lewis lamented certain developments in education that focused more and more on our own subjective sentiments than on authentic human value and human engagement with the world. And the approach he criticized was one that was radically present-minded, believing that the past was fit only for overcoming. The past is always the benighted thing we leave behind. It can't teach us anything. So as a result, we lose much of the strength of tradition and move into a world, he says, of false sentiments. And we will pay a heavy price for this dereliction, Lewis predicted, for, quote, a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. Now, part and parcel of the abolition of man was our alleged conquest of nature. So he already had a handle on this. This is 1944, and Lewis is responding in part to what he knew of the programs going on in Nazi Germany. And this is in part his philosophical response to that. He worried about selective breeding. He worried about the terrible implications of eugenics. This is not exclusively a phenomenon of Germany in the mid-20th century. There were eugenics laws on the books in all the Western democracies, including our own. He worried about the pretension that applied psychology would lead us to believe we had full control over ourselves, and then we would come to be dominated by our own most base wants and desires, rather than aspiring to something more hopeful and decent. We would want to embrace that which seems more manageable than seek that which is good. We would no longer be able to distinguish between what is corrupt and degenerate, because these imply a doctrine of moral value, and we would lose the ability to reflect fully on what such a doctrine involves and what it requires. So our inability to distinguish healing from curing, our refusal to reflect critically on the exponential leaps in our standards of what counts as health or wellness, the dark underside of these developments, all of these, I think, attest to the abolition of man, a sort of normative understanding of the human person that includes the recognition of our finitude. All attest to that of which Lewis wrote all those years ago. And that lurks throughout my discussion. Lewis and others have insisted that we need to ongoingly ask certain questions. What is our understanding of the dignity of the human person? In what does that dignity consist? Who is in and who is outside the boundary of full moral concern, and why? Now, inevitably, questions of health and disease, of curing and healing, lead us back to these first-order questions. And it seems to me that that is entirely as it should be, and that the danger is that we are losing much of the rich conceptual repertoire that has historically been available to us that helps us to think through these issues. Thank you very much. Thanks.